Hello everybody. I'd like to tell you about one of my favorite poets, Basho. First, listen to what he says about himself. In this mortal frame of mine, which is made of 100 bones and 9 orifices, there is something, and this something is called a wind-swept spirit, for it is much like a thin drapery that is torn and swept away at the slightest stir of the wind. I forgot to mention about a few important things. For one thing, Basho was born in 1644, just southeast of Kyoto, and he began composing haiku when he was only 12 years old. He worked for a family, and then he wandered around and he published some books until 1675, when he began taking on students, and he published some more books. And then he worked some more, and then he published more poetry, and suddenly he began to study Chinese poetry and Zen, and he became a monk. And he left public life in 1680, and he moved to a small little hut, and he was given a large banana tree, which is called a basho tree. And this tree gave him his name. He began to be known as Basho. Back to what he says. This something in me took to writing poetry years ago, merely to amuse itself at first, but finally, making it its lifelong business. It must be admitted, however, that there were times when it sank into such dejection that it was almost ready to drop its pursuit. Or again, times when it was so puffed up with pride that it exulted in vain victories over the others. And what was going on in his life? Well, fire destroyed much of the place he was living, called Edo, and his little hut. And he began to travel around the world. Well, around his world. He had a travel journal, much like some of us, and then he returned to his home in Edo in 86. Then he took off again, on the road. He sold his home, he went north, he wrote another masterpiece called Narrow Road to the Far North. And then he began the concept of sabi, which is solitariness and loneliness that results in lightness and intense concentration. In 91 he returned to Edo. In 93, however, his health began failing. And he introduced a new idea called karumi, which he described as like looking at a shallow river with a sandy bed. And that year, in November 93, he died. His death poem. Sick on a journey, my dreams wander the withered fields. Let's look back again. He said, indeed, ever since it, that spirit he spoke about, began to write poetry, it has never found peace with itself, always wavering between doubts of one kind and another. At one time, it wanted to gain security by entering the service of a court. At another, it wished to measure the depth of its ignorance by trying to be a scholar, but it was prevented from either because of its unquenchable love of poetry. The fact is, it knows no other art than the art of writing poetry, and therefore it hangs on to it more or less blindly. And now, some haiku by Basho. Autumn moonlight. A worm digs silently into a chestnut. A bee staggers out of the peony. A cicada shell, it sang itself utterly away. The beginning of art, a rice planting song in the back country. Midfield, attached to nothing, the skylark singing. Winter solitude, in a world of one color, the sound of wind.